Hello. This is Tales of Dread. In this episode, we'll talk about people who disappeared in national parks. Also known as the 411 that went missing. David Politis, a former police officer who is now a writer, thinks that something strange is going on in and around the national parks in North America. After making a list of thousands of strange deaths and disappearances, we also wonder if there is something in the woods that is hunting and stalking people. Some of the most haunting and beautiful places on Earth are in North America's national parks. From Yosemite and Yellowstone in the United States to Yoho and Jasper in Canada, all of these beautiful places have something special to offer. Whether it's mountain ranges with snow-capped peaks, calm lakes, grasslands that go on as far as the eye can see, or forests that seem to go on forever. People come from all over the world to visit these parks by the millions. Their landscapes are truly beautiful, so it's no surprise that people come back year after year to see these areas of outstanding natural beauty. But it shouldn't be a surprise that many people get lost while hiking or hunting in these areas. Most of them are found by search and rescue teams within 48 hours, but some disappear, often in mysterious and unexplained ways, and are never seen again. These places may be amazing and hard to forget. But among all this beauty, there seems to be a dark and scary truth that the authorities don't want to talk about. People in the US often call it the country's silent mass disaster. Over the last few hundred years, thousands of people have been leaving national parks. We don't know the exact number because, surprisingly, the US National Park Service has only just started to make a database of these missing people. This is something that David Politis found out by accident. A former police officer who is now a writer is looking into how strangely these people seem to disappear. Politis has written a series of books called The Missing 411 that list more than 1,000 of these strange disappearances. Even though he does a lot of research, the picture he draws is not the whole story. He worries that there could be a lot more cases that no one knows about and probably never will. He started working on this project soon after he went to a national park and was talked to by a ranger who told him he was part of a search and rescue team for a couple of recent disappearances that no one could explain, and that he thought something bigger was going on. Being an experienced outdoorsman himself, he was surprised to hear that hunters and hikers who knew the area well were going missing. He promised to look into it because he thought it was a strange idea. He didn't know it at the time, but he was about to start an almost impossible task that would take him years of research and investigation. It would lead to a large body of work that would put these mysteries in the spotlight. He started by getting rid of some things so he could focus only on things that couldn't be explained by normal logic or behavior. He didn't look at cases where there was clear evidence of wrongdoing, mental illness, and the possibility of suicide, which are all clear signs of an animal attack. There is a chance that missing people drowned or were washed away, at least for the first few cases in and around cities. Over time, he noticed that these disappearances happened in groups, especially near national parks and the Great Lakes in North America. He came to the conclusion that something strange is going on, something that is both hard to explain and hard to find, something that is both unsettling and mysterious. He thinks that these disappearances could be caused by an unknown force that is smart, patient, sneaky, and can't be seen. Here are a few of the strangest disappearances that have ever been reported in the U.S. and Canadian national parks. When thinking about these cases, you should keep in mind that normal explanations have either been completely ruled out, or are very unlikely. Possibly. The most famous case of someone disappearing without a trace in a national park is that of Dennis Martin, a 6-year-old boy who went on a hike with his father, grandfather, and 9-year-old brother to Spence Field on July 14, 1969. Dennis, his brother, and a couple of other young boys they knew decided to play hide and seek around 4 p.m., as the game ended. Dennis was the only one who didn't come out of his hiding place. The last time anyone saw him, he was running toward a bush on the edge of the field, behind which was thick forest. His father, William Martin, grew more worried and ran 2 miles up the Appalachian Trail to try to find his son. But there was nothing found. Over the next 2 weeks, more than 1,500 people looked for the missing child over an area of 56 square miles with the help of helicopters and sniffer dogs, but they never found him. Even a crack team of Green Berets helped with the search, but they worked alone and wouldn't talk to anyone outside of their group, which was strange in and of itself, according to many people. Most of the time, the Green Berets would only be called out for national security issues. On the day Dennis went missing, the Kay family was hiking up towards Rowan's Creek, which is about 4 kilometers from Spence Field. At about 5:30 p.m., they heard a terrible scream. When they looked in the direction of the scream, it had been about an hour and a half since Dennis had been seen last. They saw what looked like a cross between a bear and a man carrying a small child over its shoulder and running screaming into the thick forest. The FBI said this was not true because the time frames were too small and no one could have hiked that far over such rough terrain in such a short time. But a ranger named Dwight McCarter, who was part of the search, showed that this was not true. When he walked the same route in a little more than an hour, trainee Gibson was a high school student from Knoxville. In October 1976, he went on a field trip to the Great Smoky Mountains. As the afternoon went on, she and 40 of her classmates were hiking from a parking lot to a place called Andrews Bald. The students split up into smaller and smaller groups based on how fast they could walk. When the trainee stopped in the middle of the path, she was about 20 meters ahead of the rest of her group. Friends said that she kept looking to the side, almost as if she had seen something interesting in the bushes. She then left the path in the direction she was looking and was never seen again. At first, the police didn't believe her friends about where she had left the path, because it was a steep, almost vertical drop, followed by hundreds of meters of dense woods that would have been impossible to get through, even though many people tried to find it. In July 2010, trainee Gibson was never found. A man named Eric Lewis and 2 other people were climbing Mount Rainier. All of them were tied to the same piece of rope and were about 20 to 30 meters apart. Don Storm Jr., who was in charge of the climb, stopped at 14,000 feet and waited for his 2 friends, so that they could all reach the top of the mountain together. Trevor Lane, the second climber, joined him soon after, and they both waited for Eric to arrive. He never did. When they pulled in the rope, they saw that he wasn't attached to the other end, even though they had seen him behind them just a few minutes before. Bad weather was coming in, so they thought he had gotten off the rope to take a break, which would have been very risky going back down the mountain, but not unheard of. They saw no sign of him at all, and his tracks seemed to end in the middle of nowhere. Helicopters searched the slopes but didn't find anything. Eric was never found. His backpack, climbing harness, and snow shovel were found at 13,600 feet, but he was not. Stephanie Stewart was a fire spotter for Jasper National Park in Alberta, Canada. She was 70 years old. On the night of August 26, 2006, she was working at the Athabasca Lookout Tower, which is 25 miles northwest of Hinton and very far away. She had a very important job. During the day, she looked for signs of bushfires and slept at the tower at night. On August 27th, she forgot to do a regular radio check-in with her boss, which she was supposed to do at least 3 times a day. Another fire spotter was sent to the tower to see how she was doing, but she was no longer there. The only thing that wasn't there was her blanket. There were no signs of a struggle or a forced entry. The stove was on and a pot of water was on the stovetop, but the water had already boiled away. Her truck was still outside, and the police found no other tracks in or out of the area besides the ones made by her own car. She was smart and had a family who loved her. She probably wouldn't have just left in the middle of the night. Stephanie was never seen again for no clear reason, and her disappearance led the provincial government to change the way lookout towers work in the area. In December of 1974, McCulloch was a 19-year-old Virginian who took pictures for fun. He took a long trip to the west coast by hitchhiking and taking pictures of the scenery along the way. In January the following year, he went to Oregon to stay with a friend. He planned a short trip to make a lake so he could take photos of the beautiful winter scenery there and then go back to his friend's house. After 2 days, he never did. But even though there were a lot of search and rescue efforts, nothing was found. There were no tracks, no clues, no witnesses, nothing. A year later, 2 hikers found a backpack 12 miles from the trailhead. When authorities looked at it, they found that it belonged to Charles. The park rangers sent a horse patrol to the same area within hours, and soon after that, they found McCulloch's body, or what was left of it. To say the least, the scene was strange. They only found his unbuttoned jeans sitting on a log in the middle of nowhere. The jeans were frozen in place, as if an invisible man was sitting in them. As you would expect, the bottoms of his socks were showing. Inside them, they found small foot bones that were 12 feet away and the top of his head. His shirt, coat, boots, and all of his other belongings were nowhere to be found, and the rest of his body was never found. The most strange thing was how he got to this place in the first place. On the day he went missing, there was 7.5 feet of new snow on the ground. Even if he had a snowmobile, he couldn't have gone there at that time. In 2004, a case like this happened in Canada's Yukon Territory. Everyone who knew 49-year-old Bart Schleyer said he was the best outdoorsman you'd never heard of. He was smart, strong, and in amazing shape. Since he was a teenager, he had been hiking and hunting in the wilds of North America. There was no doubt about his experience. In September 2004, he hired a pilot to take him 175 miles north of Whitehorse to a remote area where he planned to hunt moose by himself. He was well prepared because he brought 3 crates of food, camping gear, and hunting gear with him. The pilot dropped him off and made plans to pick him up again in 3 weeks. No one ever saw him again after that. When the pilot got back, Bart's camp was set up and well stocked, but he couldn't find Bart anywhere. The RCMP searched the area for a long time and found some of his teeth and bone fragments on the ground about 60 feet from his camp. Not too far from these remains, they found his dry bag on the ground with a mark on it where he had been sitting, and his hunting bow propped up against a tree. Bear and wolf poop in the area ruled out the idea that he was eaten by a bigger animal, and his friends are quick to say that he was too experienced in the outdoors to have been caught off guard by a bear or other large predator. Aside from that, there were no signs of a fight on the ground or broken branches. The authorities wondered if a bear or wolf had caught him by surprise. Why hadn't his camp supplies been taken? In 2002, a 20-year-old surveyor from Los Angeles was involved in a strange case. Easley, Georgia. Christopher Tompkins was part of a crew of 4 people who were working in Harris County near dense woodland. At the end of the day, the team walked back to their car along Warm Springs Road, a straight road on both sides of which is the town of Woodland. Every member of the crew was walking about 50 feet apart, and Christopher was at the end of the line. In just a few seconds, he was gone. His co-workers went back to where he was last seen and found about 12 cents and coins on the ground. They also found fibers from one of his work pants and a work boot caught on the barbed wire fence that ran along the road. Christopher was never found, even though hundreds of people looked for him in many different places. After a few months, the property owner found his other boat near a swamp, about 900 yards from where he was last seen. They found the things in his pockets on the road, which suggests that he had been turned on his head. On the night of June 11, 2005, Todd Guide was a 22-year-old man from Cazenovia, Michigan. He and his cousin went to a keg party, but they left around 12:30 a.m. He did it because he was tired. Even though he hadn't had much to drink, he decided to walk home instead of taking the risk of driving while drunk. A little after 12:51 a.m. he called a friend and said, "I'm in a field," before the call ended suddenly. The friend called him back, but all he heard was heavy breathing or wind before the call ended again. Todd tried to call his friend back twice more, the last time at 12:57 a.m., but no one heard from him again that night. The next day, he didn't show up to a family party, which was totally out of character for him. When no one else had seen him after the party, his worried parents reported him missing. There was a huge search with over 1,500 volunteers and helicopters with infrared cameras that dragged and dove in lakes and swamps in the area, but nothing was found. It was as if Todd had just vanished from the world. 3 weeks later, on July 2nd, a couple walking along the shore of Open Hall Lake saw something in the water. It looked like a man standing straight up, with his head and shoulders bobbing on the water. It turned out to be Todd Guide's dead body. Everyone was surprised by where he was found, because the lake had been looked for many times in the weeks before, and it was in the exact opposite direction of where he had been going. The official cause of death said that he drowned while drunk, but there was no water in his lungs and his blood alcohol level was not very high. So who or what is to blame for these killings and disappearances? Collider's doesn't want to point the finger at one person or thing, but he has indirectly hinted at a few possibilities, and the tone of his books makes it clear that something strange is going on. Skeptics have mostly said bad things about Collider's work, saying that he often leaves out details that don't fit with his story and that there are good reasons for each of these cases. Their reasons include attacks by animals, a serial killer, or maybe even a lot of people getting lost and hurt. Having a strong desire to disappear on purpose or kill oneself. Drug dealers or people who make drugs who do business out in the wild and kill people who find them quickly or suddenly because of illness or exposure. Animal attacks always leave clues, like blood, bits of flesh, torn clothing, tracks, and broken branches or disturbed ground, which show that a fight took place. There is no proof of this in any of the cases Collider presents, so he rules this out as a possibility. The same is true for serial killers. It's very unlikely that they wouldn't leave some sign that they were there. It is very possible to get lost and confused. But many people who go missing are very familiar with their surroundings and have hiked or hunted in the same places many times before. If they do get lost, why do search parties get together? Even with sniffer dogs and infrared-equipped helicopters that could see ahead, they couldn't find them. As far as their friends and co-workers knew, all of these people were in good mental health. So suicide is unlikely, but not impossible. On the other hand, someone could disappear on purpose to start a new life, but that would be a huge task that would take months to plan and cost a lot of money. It would also be hard to keep this from friends and family. In either case, this doesn't explain why search and rescue teams haven't been able to find any sign of them. It is not unusual for drug makers to work in remote areas. After all, anyone who has seen the TV show Narcos knows that Pablo Escobar hid his drug-making operations in the Colombian jungles. But, given how many people visit every year, it seems unlikely that this would happen in the national parks of North America. Drug dealers would know that killing someone would bring the National Park Service, which is not what they want, to the area. The most likely reason for these disappearances is that search and rescue teams and police officers finally died of an illness or injury they got while hiking. Colliders also says that many of these people had some kind of disability or illness or said they were sick before they disappeared. But it's very strange that search and rescue teams still couldn't find their bodies. If someone was sick, you might think they wouldn't go too far from the paths they know. Whenever? Accident victims might not be too hard to find either, especially with the help of sniffer dogs and search helicopters with infrared. So, when all of these explanations have been tried, colliders are left puzzled by the things that seem to be the same in each case. For example, when dead bodies are found, they rarely find the victim's shoes or boots, and the cause of death is rarely found to be satisfactory. Some people have said that these disappearances are caused by something paranormal or supernatural. Theories have included everything from woodland spirits to large cryptids like Bigfoot or the dogman, alien abductions, people slipping through interdimensional portals, and even certain plants putting up some kind of defense when humans are near. People have had these kinds of things happen to them in national parks and still lived to tell the story. A strange thing called the silence has been reported by a lot of hikers. It usually happens when a person is walking through a forest and all the animals stop making noise, the wind stops blowing through the leaves, and the air around them seems to get heavier. From what I can tell, people often say that it makes them feel like someone or something is watching them or following them. The same thing happened to Jan Maccabee, who was bow hunting in Ohio in 2010. She was with her husband, Bruce Maccabee, a well-known optical physicist. It was around 6:30 p.m. And she was about 15 feet above the ground in a tree hide. She said that everything went quiet all of a sudden, and after a few minutes, she saw a strange distortion moving through the branches about 20 feet away from where she was standing. She said that it looked like a person and that it seemed to be covered. She took one picture of it before it moved away and the sounds of animals came back. The sun is shining on the back of the picture, which looks like the edge of her face with hair sticking out from behind it. In 2016, YouTuber Scott Carpenter posted an interesting video that seems to show what looks like a Bigfoot peeking out from behind a tree while being perfectly hidden by its surroundings. Even if this is just another case of pareidolia, it is still interesting. Nonetheless, no matter what is behind these disappearances, whether it's something paranormal, supernatural, or just plain normal, the thought of getting lost in such a large and often dangerous area is still scary. These places are great examples of how beautiful our world can be, and you shouldn't let this episode stop you from going there if you ever get the chance. But we want you to be on the lookout, make all the necessary plans and safety precautions, and be ready for an unexpected bedtime story. In August of 1958, in northern Colorado, David saw one of the first things that he thought looked like a case of a missing 411. At the time of the accident, Bobby Bishop was only 10 years old. He and a group of other boys were at a Catholic school retreat. At Camp St. Malo in the Rocky Mountain National Park foothills, the only son of an Air Force sergeant was severely deaf and could only hear well with the help of a hearing aid. He was a shy child who liked to be alone more than with his peers. However, he loved the quiet of the outdoors. Around 6 p.m. on August 15th, Bobby was playing alone on a hill path just above the camp when one of the counselors came up to him and told him that dinner was ready. The trail back to camp wasn't very long, and the counselor walked just ahead of the child. As they got closer to the outside buildings, the man turned around to make sure that Bobby could see what he was saying, but when he did, the boy was gone. The counselor ran to get help, and the adults in the camp went back up the trail right away to look for Bobby, who couldn't be found. During the next 4 days, up to 300 people, including airmen from Bobby's father's base at Larry Air Force Base, searched an area of about 16 square miles. Bloodhounds were given samples of the kids and their clothes, and divers thoroughly searched all of the open water. However, it would take the better part of a year before any clue about what happened to the boy was found. On 6 June 1959, counselors who were leading a hike through a ravine north of the camp found something very sad. Just off the trail ahead of them was what looked like a pile of trash that had been left behind. When they looked more closely, they saw that it was made up of small human bones and pieces of clothing that had been thrown away. Hearing aid investigators didn't know what to think. Since Bobby went missing a year ago, the ravine in question had been used frequently by hikers. As part of the first search, it had been gone over several times, but where it was even more of a mystery. Bobby's body was found 5 miles from the camp, on the slopes of Mount Meeker, 2,500 feet above sea level. Why had the shy and nervous 10-year-old gone so far in the wrong direction to get to the camp? And how did his body not get found along the heavily traveled route that had been searched over and over by rescuers? The camp counselor said she didn't hear the kind of noise that usually happens when an animal attacks, so if Bobby was taken, it was done quickly and quietly. 40 years later, another boy would go missing in almost the same way. Bobby went missing 50 miles north of where he was. On October 2, 1999, early in the morning, a group of hikers were walking along the Big South Trail, which is on the far side of Rocky Mountain National Park. Among them, Jared, the youngest member of the Atadero family, was one of them. As the group walked along the trail, 3-year-old Jared was scared by how big the forest was and begged his father to let him run ahead. It was a sunny day, and the child was wearing a beige coat that stood out. So Alan Atadero agreed, joking with the other hikers as his son ran ahead about 100 feet. A short distance away, Jared stopped to talk to a pair of fishermen, and ask if they had seen any bears. The rest of the boy's family was just a short distance down the trail, so the two men talked with him for a few minutes before he went on his way. The last people to see him alive would be them. Alan and the other adults didn't seem to care that they couldn't see Jared when they walked past the fisherman. They kept walking, thinking that he was hiding behind a tree, and would pop out any second. But when he didn't come back after a few minutes, they got worried and split up to look for him. When the local sheriff's deputies arrived at the trail that afternoon, several witnesses said they had heard a child crying out around the time Jared went missing. However, they were quick to point out that what they heard was more like a child playing a game with someone than a child in trouble. Over the next few days, a large search and rescue operation was set up. During this time, an Air Force helicopter that had just arrived from Warren Air Force Base had a sudden engine failure and crashed into the forest, hurting all 5 of its passengers. After looking for Jared for 8 days with the help of more than 200 people, they couldn't find him. The operation was reluctantly called off. In May 2003, 2 hikers were exploring the woods around the trail, about half a kilometer up from where the boy had been seen last, when they found a bunch of children's clothes. 2 white and gray tennis shoes were lined up next to each other. A beige jacket and a pair of blue pants, that had been turned inside out and folded, were also nearby. Investigators were called, and they were immediately surprised by how clean the clothes were, even though they had been out in the elements for more than 4 years. A fingertip search turned up a piece of Jared's skull in the bushes behind the clothes and one of his teeth under a nearby log. It was too late to find out for sure that this part of the trail hadn't been searched because the helicopter crash had forced the rescue team to go in a different direction. The people in charge think that a mountain lion took Jared. The verdict that his family didn't agree with. They point to the fact that forensics looked at the clothes that were found and found no animal hairs or saliva on them. There was no blood on any of the clothes, and the fact that they had been taken off and turned inside out seemed to rule out an attack by a lion or any other animal that hunts for food, just like with Bobby Busy. It was like Jared Atadero had been taken from the path by an unknown force that left no trace. In 1981, another of Colorado's national parks had a disappearance that was just as strange. Morris Temetz was 84 years old. He was a reverend and religious scholar who loved the outdoors for a long time. On April 29, Reverend Metz asked his friend David McSherry to go with him to the Pikes National Forest, where he planned to look for topaz by sifting through a local creek. He was in bad health, with severe arthritis and a blood disorder, and McSherry was happy to help the older man walk between the different places he might recognize. McSherry had driven a short distance along Rampart Ridge Road near the Rampart Reservoir. When the Reverend told him to stop, he saw a small sand pit 50 meters from the road and asked his friend to help him get there. As he went over and started digging. After making sure the Mets were comfortable, McSherry went to find his own place to dig. After about 2 hours of working without getting anywhere, McSherry decided it was time to call it a day. He gathered his tools and went back to Demetz to tell him that they would be leaving soon. He then walked the short distance to where his car was parked and loaded his gear. But 15 minutes later, when he went back to the Sunday pit, it was empty. There was nothing that showed respect. Even more strange were the Mets or the tools he was using. McSherry could only see his own footprints, which showed where he had walked. He helped the old man get into the hole and sit down. Even though it seemed unlikely, it didn't look like anyone else had come or gone from the small patch of sand. The older man might have had to go to the bathroom, so McSherry went back to the car and honked the horn, but the Reverend did not come back. McSherry panicked and drove straight to the nearest police station to report his friend missing. When they returned to the site, the police officers who accompanied him became equally concerned. There were no fresh tracks or signs of a fight or blood that could have been caused by an animal attack. The fact that the tools were gone seemed to point to something strange, especially since the older man could barely walk without help. When sniffer dogs were brought to the area, they just sat there and couldn't find any scents that led away from the pit. Some people think that Reverend Admits might have wanted to end his life in the nearby woods or reservoir, but he was a very religious man who would have hated the idea, and he couldn't walk fast enough to get away without McSherry seeing him. He just stopped being there. Not only do people go missing in the woods of North American national parks, but also in other places. As shown by the case of Dr. James McGraw-Hogan, at the beginning of 2014, he moved to Indiana because he had just been hired to work in the emergency room of a nearby hospital. Dr. MMA Grogan went to a ski resort in the White River National Forest on the morning of March 14th. The resort is near Vail Mountain, and is part of the White River National Forest. There, he met up with 3 friends who had planned to go split boarding with him at a cabin 9 miles into the park. It had snowed a lot in the days before the trip, and it was still snowing when they left at 8:30 a.m. They had a hard time of it. Grogan was the most experienced person in the group, so as the morning went on, it was only natural for him to pull ahead of the others until they couldn't see him anymore. When they got to the cabin in the middle of the afternoon, they expected to find him there waiting for them, but it was empty. After waiting to see if the doctor would come back, the group called the authorities in the area. Grogan had enough food and supplies, like a first aid kit and a sleeping bag, to stay alive in the wilderness. But as the days went by, the search for him got bigger. Eventually, helicopters and snowmobiles were used as part of the search. People also tried to track down the doctor's cell phone, but other than one GPS ping on the day he went missing, they couldn't find it. There was no sign of any other transmissions. Grogan's broken body was found 20 days after he went missing by a group of skiers in the area of Booth Falls. Even though he was still wearing his skiing helmet, he got hurt in several places on his head and upper body. Even though his snowboard was nearby, his ski boots, outer coat, and gloves were not there. Even stranger, his cell phone was still working, and the extra battery was found in one of his pockets. Why was an experienced skier like James McGraw-Logan found more than 4.5 miles from the trail he had been on? Where did his shoes and clothes go? Why, if he got lost, didn't he call for help when he was in an area with good phone reception and a working cell phone? And why were the police unable to triangulate his signal while he was missing? Some people have also said that the missing 411 problem is not unique to North America. In May 2013, a huge search operation was set up in the Snowy Mountains, which are in the state of New South Wales in Australia. Given what they know about the person involved, Crab Dips, this is a case that hasn't been solved yet. At the time, Ron was 25. He went to the Charlotte Pass ski resort on May 14, 2013. He was a Canadian citizen, and a reserve member of the Canadian military. His friends said he was one of the most powerful and smart people they knew. He was in Australia, and studying law at Bond University in Queensland. He wanted to go to the Snowy Mountains. Before he went back to his home in Toronto, he went into the mountains on a clear, sunny day with food and his cell phone and disappeared right away. 2 park rangers who were working on an emergency shelter later said that they heard what they thought was a human scream. But when they went to where the sound was coming from, they didn't find anything. Since Ron has gone missing, many times, people have tried to find him in the area where they last saw him. Vodafone has given the Australian government full access to all of his phone data and records. Also, the Canadian Army has sent military experts into the mountains to try to find their missing soldier. Even with all of this technology and people looking for the missing student, nothing has ever been found. He was supposed to go back to Sydney the day after he went missing, and he left a rental car in the parking lot of the ski lodge. It was clear that he had only planned to stay for a short time, and there was no sign that he had any other plans than to enjoy the scenery. Critics of the missing 411 theory often point out that even though many of the incidents are similar, Colliders seems to ignore many other factors. People have also said that putting together so many different geographical and fundamentally different sets of circumstances makes it harder and harder to look into each case in a fair and focused way. When people look at disappearances through the lens of the missing 411 story, the possible reasons for them tend to get more and more outlandish. In an attempt to find a single explanation for as many strange events as possible, such as alien abduction, cryptid attacks, international drug cartels, or serial killer cults, no idea is too far-fetched to suggest. However, the fact remains that the great outdoors are very dangerous, full of geological features, weather conditions, and natural predators, which almost certainly account for many of these events. When certain facts come to light that Colliders had conveniently left out, many of these cases seem a lot less strange. Even though people have been skeptical for a long time, there are still a lot of things that make no sense and seem to defy most if not all rational explanations.